That is the sound of a helicopter. It's one of the most important tools we use for learning about the moose herd in Maine. You might be wondering how being up in the air helps us understand animals down on the ground, and that's what we'll be covering in today's episode. But first, we went over an exceptional amount of information in last week's episode, so I'll just quickly recap. Maine's moose population struggled before hunting restrictions and modern management techniques. It recovered, in part due to spruce budworm, which caused trees to die and prompted landowners to harvest lumber. In these clear cuts, the forest regenerated, and this provided lots of food for moose, allowing their population to flourish. The population today is very stable, but perhaps a bit too dense in some wildlife management districts, and we'll get into how we know this later in this episode. To manage moose population numbers to prevent disease and other issues, and in part due to its lively tradition in our state, we have an annual moose hunt, which is closely monitored and controlled through a lottery system. Only a couple thousand permits are allocated out of the approximately 50 to 60,000 entries each year. Each fall, hunters provide data when registering their harvested moose at tagging stations by submitting a tooth, a winter tick count, and ovaries from the cows. This is just one of the ways biologists learn about the moose herd. MDIFW has a number of ongoing studies that assist biologists in understanding the herd and predicting changes in populations, and we're going to go over a bunch of them today. My name is Katie Yates, and this is Season 5 of the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife's podcast, Fishing Game Changers. In this season, I'm exploring Maine's moose. I'll be chatting with MDIFW staff to learn more about our moose, how they're managed, and how we're working hard to keep the moose herd healthy, and to gain an understanding about the rising issue of winter tick. And if you don't know what I mean by that, you'll definitely understand more by the end of this series. Remember Lee Kantar from last week's episode? He's MDIFW's moose biologist. I mentioned in last week's episode he's extremely dedicated and devoted to his beloved moose, and has been even before he was a moose biologist.
I remember in 1987, it was 1987, which doesn't seem long ago. You probably weren't even born. So now I'm really dating myself. So I was a junior in college, and I remember that I always liked to go up to the White Mountains too, because I'd see moose once in a while, which is funny to think, being a junior in college. So I'd see moose, and I remember we were up in the Twin Mountain area, and it was in the springtime, and we saw just a massive cow, probably a pregnant cow. I remember turning around and taking photos of her with a 35 millimeter camera. Do you know what that is?
I do.
I just had to use that one. And I also used to guide trips, backcountry trips. And back in those days, I used to do it. I did it in Maine for 4 years and 2 years in the Adirondacks and up into Ontario. And I also remember, all kinds of moose encounters. And one thing that is also interesting to look back today, given what I do, is I remember being on a trip in Algonquin Provincial Park, and we pulled out of a campsite with the kids, and there was a cow and a calf with ear tags feeding in the water right at our campsite. We never even knew it till we came around. And then we were getting out of our boats to do a carry trail, and we had a moose come out, and I remember being astounded by the fact that, in the water, the moose looks big, but man, when that moose gets out of the water and starts trucking through the woods, and you're right there, it's like, that impression is like of a giant, of an absolute giant. And today that's lost on me a bit more because, I look at hundreds of moose every year, alive and as well as lots at moose check stations. So I've been around a lot of moose. But it all started back, even then and younger. When I start to look back in time and think about all those encounters, there were a lot of them before I ever became a moose biologist. And then to find myself in the position I am today, which is all about timing and good fortune, and the good fortune of having the credentials and background to fill the position. But, some of these positions you could dream about being a moose biologist, but the reality is there's not a lot of them out there. So to be in a position like this, carries a lot of weight because you want to do the right thing and you want to make a good mark because you're managing a resource for the state of Maine.
Moose eating habits and behavior will play a part in this episode, so I'll just give you some fun facts. Moose are herbivores, meaning their diet consists entirely of vegetative material. During winter months, they switch to mainly consuming twigs and bark from shrubs and young trees. In summer months, moose tend to eat leaves and underwater plants.
When a moose comes out of the wintertime and into the spring and things start to green up, and then things green up in the water, moose have this real drive and thirst for sodium. It's like the best ice cream for them, right? And so they want to seek salt, sodium salt. And a lot of times they can, people see them on the sides of the road licking the roads from salt, or where there's runoff, or where there's natural mineral licks. But aquatic vegetation is rich in sodium. So moose can go to the water in June and get sodium. They can obviously take in water, and they can eat a ton of aquatic vegetation, which is great, and then go back in the woods and chew their cud. So a lot of people think, these moose don't like bugs and all this. Well, nobody likes bugs, but no, they go to the water because of food. And look, anybody looks at the state of Maine from Google Earth or elsewhere, and we have a huge variety of lakes, ponds, wetlands, rivers, streams, and moose benefit from that because of the vegetation that goes along with it.
With the need for food, a tremendous amount of food, moose are selective when choosing habitats. We're going to talk more about this later, but pay attention to this next little bit. Cows produce their calves in May. A cow's nutritional condition or body weight determines the number of calves born and when the cow will first breed. It's possible for cows to have twins when the conditions are right.
So twinning rates a moose, when a moose has two calves, has always been considered a function in the moose world of good habitat and a population of moose that is the right number of moose, that they have plenty of feed and life is good and they have lots of twins. Western North Dakota has a really healthy moose population where they have lots of twins and tons of food. The problem with Maine is that there's no indication that it's a food problem, but what it is it's a parasite problem. And so it's acting the same way. And so we see far less twins than we saw in the last time we were able to measure and look at ovaries and cows and all that was in 1985 to 1989. So that's 30 plus years ago. And twinning rates were much higher, and the average number of calves born every year of these cows was higher as well. And so we've seen quite a decline since we've been able to measure this here.
I know that definitely got your interest, and we're going to talk about calf survival rates later. But in order for Lee to understand and make an assessment of the health of Maine's herd, he has to study them to know them and has to have an idea of what a healthy herd looks like. And compared to other areas that have moose, Maine's situation is a little unique.
When we talk about health for moose, in my mind, and what came through with the 2017 Big Game Management Plan was health is marked by not seeing diseased animals, by not seeing animals with lots of parasites, and seeing cows that when you compare them to cows across other states and provinces, they produce a lot of calves and a good amount of twins. That's a healthy population. In Maine, we have such a unique situation we talked about before, which is we have moose that live in an environment that produces a ton of food for moose. There's no, the adults have high survival rates. And so we grow a lot of moose. Moose are not like deer. If you have an 800-pound moose living in your backyard, it's not going to stay there very long because it needs a lot of food every day to maintain its weight. Now add a couple more moose in there. And the amount of room they need, the amount of habitat and food they need is extraordinary. It's not like having 3 moose is not like having 3 deer in your backyard. They're 4 or 5 times the size of a big deer. They require that much more food every day. So you have to cut a lot of woods to do that. So Maine has been in a unique situation because we have our moose habitat, what I call the core range, is our commercial forest lands.
Maine's stretches of interconnected habitat and forests are vast, stretching over millions of acres. The moose's core range is 16,000 square miles, and that's just about 10 million acres.
You know what I'm saying? Is like, even if you told people in New England that, a huge part of Maine is unorganized territories. Well, what does that mean? Well, there's no town government there, right? And there's no really permanent folks who live there, right? There's camps and whatnot, but people don't see that. Anyways, it's our commercial forest lands, and we produce a lot of moose, so we have high densities. You'd have to go to places like Newfoundland or out to Scandinavia, Sweden, to see high moose densities. In the rest of the world of moose, which let's just say Canada, let's look at North America and Alaska, you'd find moose at low density, 1 moose per square mile, something like that. That would be a normal population. So we have, we've always had moderate to high populations.
Once snow falls, biologists, assisted by forest ranger pilots at the Maine Forest Service, perform annual aerial count surveys. These aerial surveys provide an idea of general population size in the core range, and there's lots of complicated math involved in this.
When I worked out in the western United States, we're talking about big country, right? And people don't necessarily realize how big it is, like Texas, right? Or New Mexico is the 5th largest state in the U.S. People will be like, what? Well, if you're a biologist out there, how are you going to cover ground and see stuff? Well, you're going to do it in an airplane or in a helicopter. And so when I was in Washington State and New Mexico, I did a bunch of helicopter work up there, surveying things like mountain goats. Actually did surveys on black-tailed deer, which was a little on the crazy side. Did some elk surveys. They were all pretty crazy, actually, to be honest with you. High elevation. I flew around Mount Rainier doing mountain goat surveys. Anyways, when I came out here, my friend and colleague Brad Allen kept telling me, if you want to do some aerial surveys, the Maine Forest Service has helicopters.
The use of a helicopter allows the biologists to cover a ton of ground, and it's much easier to see a group of moose looking down through the trees rather than on the ground amid the thick forest. Even though moose are big, seeing lots of them is not efficient from the ground. Going up in the helicopter for this study is some pretty die-hard stuff, and I'll let Lee explain.
And this is a crazy situation, which is, you need the resources, and people don't think about this. So, yeah, there's money involved, but you have to have the helicopter. You got to have the pilots. You got to have everything fall into place that you can do this, and you have to have some trust and faith that you can pull this off. And so we initially got some funding, and it was enough money, again, no pun intended here, to do a pilot survey to see if we could institute this survey and get some data.
To get a count is more complex than just flying randomly over the landscape. There's a bit of skill involved, as well as stubborn dedication and some special equipment.
So a bubble window on a helicopter allows the observers on the left side of the ship, which is where we fly, our pilots fly on the right, to look out the window, and this is really critical, and look straight down from the skid of the helicopter out. Because as you can imagine, in the most forested state, Maine, if you were in a fixed-wing aircraft and you're flying over trees and you're looking out, the trees and the wings of the plane block your vision. You need to be able to look down, especially when trees get thick, and look in between the trees to see things, even something as big as a moose. So we put bubble windows on that helicopter, and then we bought a radar altimeter, which allows us to look at our altitude and elevation above ground level. So as the ground changes over time, you don't want to know what you are above sea level. You want to know how high you are above the ground as that changes. And for our surveys, we're flying 190 feet, 200 feet above ground level. Okay, if I was flying above you and you were on the ground, you would not be happy with me flying a helicopter 200 feet above your head. Right. You would think I was going to land on you. That's how close it is. Think about the tallest white pine tree. We're not farther above that. So we fly, even in the wintertime, I can see snowshoe hares running from the helicopter. A white snowshoe hare on white snow.
In order for the math to work, Lee has a very specific amount of space they need to cover in each wildlife management district, and they need to see a certain number of moose. This requires 2 biologists looking out those bubble windows of the helicopter. Lee mentions Scott as the other biologist in the scenario he's about to describe. He means biologist Scott McClellan. And Lee mentions Scott has been instrumental in the moose survival project and aerial surveys.
Really what matters when we fly these surveys is that you're seeing enough animals. So we fly a 100 square mile area within a management district. We divide that 100 square miles into 7 25-mile long transects that you have to fly. If you're flying along a 25-mile transect, you need to see animals. If you don't see animals and you have a big fat 0 in there, and then you fly another transect and you have a big fat 0, it's not going to go well. You're not going to be able to detect much. We're looking out the side of our window for 25 miles, which is painful because your neck is craned to the left. We look at a 200-foot strip transect, basically. We have a mark on our window that we've calibrated at the airport for 200 feet, and everything above that mark is out. It's not counted in the survey, and everything in is counted. We have a split-second difference in what we see. So sometimes a moose is running under the helicopter, and I don't see it, but it's in Scott's field. So he sees a moose, I see 0. Or there's a circumstance where I see 3 and he sees 2 or something. And we create what's called a mark recapture, that we're able to do the math and figure out what our counts look like.
Imagine flying for hours, skimming the tree line with your head poking through a bubble window sideways, looking down at the landscape, the whir and vibration of the helicopter, the flicker of the sunlight clipping the landscape. This is hardcore stuff, like I said, and they fly every day that's clear during the weeks they count the moose. Sundays, holidays, it doesn't matter. And Lee recognizes that without dedicated biologists and pilots, this count would not happen.
The biggest factor in flying a helicopter for us all day long is actually mental fatigue. You can be, like I can be looking at you, Katie, and I can be so fatigued. I'm looking at you, talking to you, and I can't even see you. I'm just like, I'm out of it. And that happens in the helicopter. So I can be staring at a moose, and this happens, and it doesn't register. It's an amazing phenomenon to me. And you can't lose focus, because the minute you lose focus, you're missing that area. So there's a lot of that involved. And we've been doing this for over a decade. And so we know some of the pitfalls and issues that we got to deal with as far as trying to stay on top of things. But it's become a really good survey for us to give us really good indications of where our moose are at. We're able to fly in 10 of the 12 management districts that make up the core range of moose. So when I say the core range of moose, the moose in the commercial forest lands, zones 1 through 11 and 19, really comprise most of the moose habitat in the state of Maine. There's moose outside of that, but the majority of moose live in those areas. And so we try to fly those on a 5-year rotation period. Every 5 years we fly. During the short window of time we have, after muzzleloader season and before February 15th is our time to fly, we're going to fly every good day, whenever that is. And that requires to have a crew that's like, yeah, I'm with you. So I call you up, I go, Katie, you good to fly tomorrow? And it's 9 o'clock Saturday night. And you're like, yep, I'm good. I'll see you at 7. And without a crew like that, you're not going to go anywhere. Because everybody can easily say, yeah, I'm not feeling it tomorrow. Of course, when's a good day to fly? It's usually going to be on a Sunday, right? It's
Yeah, of course, right.
I mean, on a holiday.
Yeah. Okay, so stay with me here. Lee also uses a helicopter for another kind of aerial survey, this time to identify cows, bulls, and calves to determine the distribution of sex.
This is a survey where if you want to know about a population of animals and you say, well, I have 1,000 moose out there, you're going to want to know, if you have 1,000 moose right over there, you want to know, well, how many of those are bulls? How many are cows? How many are calves? How are you going to know that? And you want to know that at a point in time. You can't spread that out over years. You can't spread that over months. We need to know at a certain point. So we do a different survey. We call it a comp count. It's really classifying animals.
Bull moose, of course, are well known for their large and unique palmate antler displays during the mating season. Moose antlers shed and regrow each year. Fun fact, antlers are one of the fastest growing tissues of any animal, growing as much as 8 inches in just 10 days. But how can Lee tell the difference between a bull and a cow from up in a helicopter?
Now, the beauty about moose, unlike other animals, is not only can you readily see them, even you can't rely on just antlers, okay? It's obvious if you're flying and trying to see how many bulls, cows, calves you have. You see a bull, it's like easy, yep. Katie sees a bull, okay, write that one down. But what happens when the antlers come off? Because they all come off. Well, the nice thing about moose is that all females have a white vulva patch under their tail, even when they're calves. A cow usually has a solitary brown face that can get lighter with age. It's all brown. A bull moose has a black muzzle that fades into brown. It's a bicolor face. A female and young males have a little ropey bell or dewlap under their chin. A mature bull has a big disc, a big bell disc, sometimes with a rope on it, but it can be big. Now, not all the time. And like last week when we were flying, you can see a bull that has shed or cast its antlers, and you can see the pedicels where the antlers came off. That's how close we get. So we can, with 99, and I'm saying 99.9%, we're going to accurately say that's a bull, cow, or calf.
Unlike the moose count, which relies on flying transects through wildlife management districts, for this study of classifying moose as cows, bulls, or calves, they fly directly to where they think moose might be hanging out.
When we fly into an area and we're looking for moose and moose habitat. You know, there's moose in a very forested setting, but we're not going to get the most bang for our buck. We're going to, in this particular survey, classifying, unlike the transects, you go right where the moose are and you start classifying them. Bam, bam, bam. So we've gotten really proficient, and our pilots have become experts at, from the sky, spotting and seeing moose habitat. The other day, I think we had 9 moose in one cut. And when that happens, you come down into the cut, you've seen 2 moose, and all of a sudden all the guys are saying, hey, I got 2 on my side, I got 3 over here, I got 4 there. Okay, hold on a second. Chris, bring us around. He brings us around. We come back in. Everybody's got their eyes on the thing. And then somebody's like, okay, I got 2 bulls, 3 cows, 2 calves. Bam. We're out of here. Move on to the next.
So what does the distribution of cows, bulls, and calves look like in Maine?
We look at ratios based on bulls to 100 cows, calves to 100 cows. It's on a per 100 basis is the way we look at it. And in the state, we've always been kind of managing at 60 bulls per 100 cows. You can go much lower than that. It does not have to be 1-to-1. But this brings us back to the harvest data, because when we look at bull moose, you can look at 60 bulls per 100 cows. But of those 60 bulls per 100 cows, how many of those are mature bulls versus younger bulls? And that's what the tooth data tells us.
Remember in last week's episode, moose teeth are collected from harvested moose during the moose hunt, and it's the best way to age a moose.
And then we look at calf-cow rates from the air as well. So we look at, anywhere from 25 to 50 calves. We have fairly low calf-cow rates, which brings us to a whole nother conversation about ticks and productivity and everything else to do with moose.
Remember earlier when Lee and I were talking about calf survival rates and the high density of Maine's moose population? We're going to circle back to that now.
So we've always had monitor high populations, and everything has been fine with that up until the point where, starting probably in the late 90s, we started to see once in a while, where in the springtime, we'd get people who spent a lot of time in the woods saying, hey, I was in the woods this April, and I saw a bunch of dead moose. What's going on there? So the long story short is, as the 2000s came in, and now we're 21 years into the 2000s, not only have we had, no pun intended, an uptick in this parasite called the winter tick, but we've had a climate that has moderated. It has a lot of ramifications for the environment and for moose as well.
MDIFW biologists have been implementing more innovative ways to monitor the moose population in the face of a changing climate and the persistent parasite winter tick. This does not happen in a vacuum. Lee is always communicating with other biologists and his counterparts, other moose biologists, or moose people as he calls them, and reviewing MDIFW records that go way back to the 1960s.
I'm going to go to the North American Moose Conference. And it's like, what? It's like, well, everybody has a conference, right? Well, that's our thing, right? All the moose people get together once a year, and they talk about moose research and management. Anyways, part of that community is you're learning from each other, right? I mean, biologists are always trying to figure out what's the next move, what do I learn, how do I learn from other people, and we form really good relationships with neighboring states and provinces, and we kind of help each other out. When we started, a decade or more ago, looking at things like I was saying before, where we had a bunch of moose in a particular spring that were found dead, and people wanted to know why. You look back at the record of these things over time. I mean, the state of Maine, you can go way back into the 60s in our records, and you can see that biologists and wardens were looking at moose all those years. Somebody finds a dead moose in the woods, a moose gets hit by a vehicle, some circumstance, they're looking at that animal and recording what's going on. So it's not, things change over time, but the department has always had their eye on those type of things. So anyways, back in the early 2000s, the state of New Hampshire and New Hampshire Fish and Game and the University of New Hampshire was doing some work on adult and calf survival, and they had collared animals. And they were starting to see where they're finding some problems with the calves, and they were starting to see a little bit of winter tick. And winter tick has been known to moose people across moose range, where in certain years, in the spring, they'll find a lot of dead young animals. And then it tends to go away. And then maybe years later it happens, and they see a die-off of a bunch of animals from winter tick. So New Hampshire had an inkling that something was going on back in the early 2000s. So, we got talking about this stuff, and then you start to get some legs. And we decided in 2013 that we were going to look at doing a GPS collar study. We decided to start on this adult cow and calf survival study because there's no more important out there than mama. So you gotta figure out what's going on with the adult cow and look at our productivity and survival. And then you want to know what's happening to calves. Now, in this study, when we talk about calves, we're not talking about a calf that's born in May, although that was part of our work when we looked at the adult cows. But we're talking about the calf in January, because the calf in January, which is now 7 to 8 months old, we knew that if winter tick is going to be identified as a real problem in this state, we know that winter tick is attacking that moose over wintertime. And we're going to lose that moose. If we're going to lose that moose, it's going to be in April.
So for the past 7 years, MDIFW has used native range wildlife capture services to capture moose and fit them with a GPS collar. For this study, they focused on cows and calves to determine calf survival, adult cow survival, and cow productivity. We're going to talk more about winter tick and its impact on moose in next week's episode, but you need to understand how Lee has come to this point in understanding first. In order to do that, you gotta catch a moose.
I mean, how do you catch moose, right? It's not like catching a mouse. Anyways, we hired a capture crew to do some net gunning out of a helicopter, which you do at about 20 to 30 feet from the moose. So not only are you in a helicopter, flying down over low elevation, but you got to be right above ground level to throw a net using a 308 charge net gun over a moose that's running. Don't do that at home, folks. Yeah, so this net gun is, again, a 308 charge, and it's a plastic square cone. It's a cone that's in this gun. And in the four corners, it has weights in the four corners. So when the net is discharged, it flies out at its widest point with the weights in the four corners. When it gets on the moose, it slows them down just enough so that they can set down the helicopter skids, and then two or one mugger, they're called moose muggers, jump out.
Moose muggers is a terrible description. Basically, the crew comes up to the moose, they blindfold it to calm it down and secure it so it doesn't harm itself or somebody else. They affix the GPS collar, take a weight, biological samples, some blood, and then release the moose, and this all happens in under 10 minutes.
And typical with most animals, it's like if you find a bird on the sidewalk that's numb or something, they always tell you put it in a box and make it dark, because once they do that, the animal becomes calm. Well, it's not any different than a moose. Once the blindfold is put on the moose becomes calm. So these animals are not sedated. They're not chemically immobilized.
In addition to capturing moose with a net from a helicopter, Lee also has collared moose while they're swimming in the water. These collars provide updates twice a day on each collared moose, allowing biologists to track movement and understand habitat use and seasonal movement patterns.
To date, we've done, I think, 675 moose. Ourselves, me and the other guys, have captured 25 plus in the water. So this year we just captured 70. We just did 70 calves, put on GPS collars and ear tags, and collected some blood from them. So that's the process. Now the animals have a new necklace on them that has a GPS unit that transmits 2 locations a day, one in the morning, one in the evening. It also has a VHF device on it, which is a transmitter that I can take an antenna and I can find that moose in the woods. I can walk in on that moose with my antenna and figure out exactly where it is to get a visual on it. Now, for 7 summers, I hired young wildlife students to go track those moose for 12 weeks all summer. That's all they did, is they'd walk in the woods and try to sneak up on that cow to see if she had the calf with her or not. And they had a routine where they had to do this and verify the calf alive at 3 different points until they knew it was good to go, meaning it was going to survive into the fall, or that the cow did not have a calf. So they did that for 7 years. We did that in the summertime. So that was a kind of another part of the project. The GPS collars would tell us every day. I could go onto Google Earth and I could download my moose and look at them on there and find out where they were. But if a moose dies, it would send me an email and a text saying there was a mortality detected. And for 7 years, when I would receive that text at 11 o'clock at night on a Saturday night, I'd wake up in the morning in the Bangor area and drive my truck and snowmobile north, get in my snowmobile, keep driving, then get on my snowshoes until I got to that moose and try to figure out, I'd recover the moose and figure out what killed it.
Day or night, when a moose unfortunately dies, Lee answers the call, finds the moose, and determines what happened. In next week's episode, we're going to talk more about what Lee learned from the moose necropsies, or like moose autopsies. But what you need to know for now is winter tick was the culprit more often than not.
But we've learned a tremendous amount from all of that work. And, all roads essentially led back to the impact of winter ticks. And in a nutshell, what we saw in 7 years in 650 animals was that winter tick was the driver. And so, it was a tough thing to learn for our moose, and we're still working on trying to further understand the dynamics with winter tick and moose and climate and how all those 3 things interact to see where we are today and for the future. So it gets complicated.
In this episode, we talked about 2 aerial surveys to count and categorize moose, and a 3rd study where they placed GPS collars on moose, track them, and if they die, determine how. And through all this, it's become apparent. Winter tick is the main driver behind the low birth rates and low survival rates of Maine's calf moose. In next week's episode, we're going to dive deep. We're going to talk about everything winter tick, what we know, how it impacts the moose herd, and how winter ticks are different from other ticks you might hear about. And you'll also hear the potential solution for stopping them.